Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Kelvin Lwin. He is CEO and founder of Alin.ai. Welcome to the show.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have a great conversation today. A lot of we'll get into some strange but beautiful stuff from the perspective of maybe the listener, although the listeners have been listening to me get into all this stuff for a long time. So very excited. You worked at NVIDIA and are now starting your own company. And I believe it has to do with hardware and software, the relationship between hardware and software within a GPU. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. There's quite a lot of things I'm trying to do, but mostly it's about understanding all of these different topics, but bringing into a cohesive sort of framework and whole. And to do that, you need to understand all the aspects of it, not just the AI model, but the software that runs it, and then the underlying hardware that makes it faster and etc. And also in terms of spirituality and things we will talk about, what is the point of AI and doing all these things? So for me, that's sort of where my strength is in the generalist sort of broad understanding of all those things, but enough to be dangerous in each of those areas. Maybe not enough to hire me. That's why I'm now the CEO, so nobody has to hire me, pay me. And some people say, sometimes you grow to the point where you can't be hired anymore. So I think I might be reaching at that point. So
Unemployable.
yeah.
I also feel that I'm also unemployable, and AI is so interesting for me because it represents this thing that allows me to do all these things. Before, because I was a generalist, I would look into these specialties and there would be so much complexity inside the specialty and I'd have nowhere to begin. I could go read encyclopedias, I could go get all those textbooks and all those things, but something about the chatbot interface with the AI just really allows me to start at the very basics, have the AI explain to me the very basic stuff. And it doesn't need to be an expert in all these things. It just needs to have the basic level understanding. And then from there, once I've learned that basic understanding, delve further and further into these rabbit holes. And I loved what you said about having to understand the whole thing. Because if you don't understand the whole thing, then what are we doing? We're just creating better ad mechanisms on Facebook. Is that what we're doing? Like 0.5% faster ad reload or something like that? Like, is that all we're doing?
Or increase
Yeah.
the click-through rates, right? That's always been one of the limitations, right? Of, I think, technology and smart people used to go into finance, and then now smart people go into computer science. And then you're like, what are we trying to make other people do using all that intelligence and all that wisdom? And it's not even crazy wisdom as you would say, but just normalized wisdom. You're like, wait, is that the outcome? I'm just trying to convert more and more people to click through stupid ads. So.
Yeah. And it feels like that part of technology has only kind of shown up in the last 10 to 15 years, that sort of like we're doing these special things within these disciplines and we're all changing the world somehow. But there's no direct relationship. Like back when the 1980s and the 1990s, it feels like there was a direct relationship between technology and changing the world in these really important, impactful ways. But the last 10 to 15 years, it seems disconnected. And it's something about the social media and the way that social media spreads information, it feels like, or just a lack of like real strong innovation. But is it innovation? This is why I'm really excited to talk to you, because there's this other layer of spirituality, which it seems woo to a lot of people, particularly the most important parts of spirituality seem woo to a lot of people, which I as a protection mechanism, which makes sense. Like there's nothing wrong with protecting yourself unless you're trying to change the world. Then maybe you shouldn't be protecting yourself. What's your take on that?
I think there's two things. One is people are trying to change the world, but people don't think about to what, right? I think for me, the world's already changing. In fact, it's kind of going crazy and the changes are there. And I don't know if everybody will make it. So for me, the mission or objective would be different. The other thing, harking it back to understanding the whole and the everything is, like Facebook, social media. I think that was a distinct thing of changing the world is okay, but change means both good and bad, right? And I think we lost the concept of leaving the world better than we found it kind of thing. People think that technology and progress for the sake of it, it will always end up being better, but that hasn't been proven to be true. But underlying that, I think there was this very dangerous trend that has come up with Facebook and things like that, where hacking your way through, like
Mm. Yeah.
make do fast and break things kind of
Yeah.
thing. But that's that's what a hack has never been a good connotation in the past, right?
Not
And
a long-term stable solution.
yeah, and if you break something like consciousness, we don't know, understand it enough to put it back together. So
Ooh.
I think generally that hacking has kind of shown us that we've hacked and broken democracy and all the ways that people communicate and make sense. And like that's why sense making is a big topic now, because people lost all those mechanisms because it's all through language, and it's only going to get worse with AI and LLMs. But more importantly, I think it's that mentality of, oh, I don't understand this whole thing. I'm going to treat it as a black box. And then I think I'm smart enough. So I'm going to just poke
Mm.
around and do hacks. And then I get somewhere. So I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm really great. And then by the time you're done with it, you're like, oh, crap, where did I lead to? Because there was not an understanding of the complexity of the whole thing and what we're trying to do. So I think that's the biggest danger to me, that the legacy of the social media era and everything. It just now there's lots of like consciousness hacking and those one. I wince at that because it's like, well, you can't reboot your mind, I would say.
Beautiful. The step you mentioned of people sort of, drilling down into a specialty and then changing the world and not connecting it to their daily activities and then waking up. What I got from you was that there was a sort of waking up moment that people realized that that happened. But I find that most people aren't even realizing it. So it's just like they don't, because the past becomes so difficult to look at because we're in this
Mm,
world that's so fractured, and we have smart people doing what they've been told is really important for them to do. And it seems just like it's this train wreck and no one is going back to look at what happened. And if people looked at what happened, what they were doing in their own lives and tried to connect it, but the other issue is that the whole thing is too complex. It's too difficult to understand, even no matter how intelligent you are. So what, like, and you mentioned not everyone is going to make it. That seems like another important point because society is going through these massive transitions and we have AI coming in. And so let's go into the spiritual aspect because there's another theme here specifically related to Silicon Valley, which is about the consciousness hacking. Something happened in the 1960s where,
mm,
particularly in the Bay Area, where people started looking to the East to solve some of the problems that modernity gave us, which is, wow, we have so much, we have a golden age, we have so much abundance, but I feel sick inside. And something about
mhm,
Christianity didn't actually get to it, couldn't solve that. So there was a lot of innovation inside of Christian churches. Actually, that's, I would say it's about 80% of innovation in spirituality happened within the Christian context, but about 20%, most of it in San Francisco Bay Area or maybe Manhattan, went east and brought a bunch of different stuff back. And in the 2010s, and when I started to investigate this stuff, that felt good. Just like you were talking about technology, this automatic, like it's going to be good. It felt great that the East was like combining with the West. And then I started to break my own consciousness and realized that there were things I was messing around with, which were far, far beyond what I should have been messing around with. And it was like
mm.
a sort of tragic thing that happened. And I see other people doing this, and it feels hopeless. Like there's no way to break through to try to show them that they might be running into the same problems that I ran into. What's your take on that?
Well, there was a phrase what you said, which is like, not no matter how intelligent you are, you're not going to make it, or it may be too much. That's because it has nothing to do with intelligence. It will be wisdom.
Mm.
So you have to cultivate wisdom, right? That's sort of the message from the East. But the West, in a way, it's like it's a very instinctual thing to break out of this rational sort of concrete mindset that they were in. And I think the spiritual forces kind of seeded the West with, LSD in
Mm.
particular. I think all those, 60s, that you can say it's looking to the East, but I think there was some
In the West, it was coming
catalyst to
from the
make
West.
them
Yeah,
look
yeah,
to the East
yeah.
to realize, oh, wait, what I have is not sufficient. And I think that's sort of the hope of it, that somehow people get put on the journey and all of these wisdom exists. But the East is not so clean as you say, right?
Yeah.
There's plenty of same mistakes that the East have made that kind of caused regression and digression and pollution and all that. So when you try to wholesale adopt something you don't understand, then with the same mentality, oh, I'm going to shortcut, or somehow I think I'm smart enough that I can uh, shortcut and overcome all the blockages that ancestors and other people do. I can do it much faster, much more whatever through all these aids. And then usually that cultivation of wisdom just takes time. And people are
Mm.
just not putting the time to do that, crazy or not. I think wisdom always takes time. And to know what is useful or not, you have to go through that empirical exercise. And then having that very stable framework, and then knowing what to do, knowing what not to do. I mean, some people would say, like now that you know it, it's a blessing in a sense
Yeah,
that you wouldn't
yeah,
make those
yeah,
mistakes
yeah,
again,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But
Mhm.
before you do that, even if you have a chance to go back and tell your younger self, "Ah, you don't know what you're talking about, Stuart. You're just an old fuddy orthodox person, who you're not just brave enough." Like, but that's why wars are fought with the young males. Like, kind of that's just the energy of the, I think, life progression and everything. But yeah, generally, I think we can know that, and that's why, tying back to AI and stuff like that. For me, you can't just say, here's the wisdom and here's what
Yeah,
everybody
yeah,
should
yeah,
adopt.
yeah.
It doesn't work. You have to gently guide on where that person is at the right time, at the right place, the right advice, and then giving them room to also make that mistake. Like, I think one of the tendency of teachers or people in general thinks, oh, I can save people from making that mistake. It's like, usually not. I think only when somebody have enough pain,
Yeah.
they will look for a better or more holistic solution. Because before then, they would somehow think this, and speaking in AI optimization, they will be like local optimum. People are very happy with whatever local optimum they're in. And then when you tell them, hey, there's a better one out there, they're like, no, no, mine is good. And I know, like, this is good. And you're like, wait, it will seem like you found it, but that's how local optimum works. And then they won't understand until they hit that breaking point. They're like, oh yeah, I guess was not sustainable. So I think generally that's sort of how I see it. It's the solution is the personalization, but no amount of teacher, human or devas or whatever will have enough capacity. So we have to use technology, but it's to really guide that person through that progression while making all these mistakes and somehow hopefully minimizing. It's not a, how do I say it? It's not a critical kill shot kind of thing.
Mm,
They make
mm,
mistakes, but they still have a chance to rectify and
mm.
find the right path again. I think that's the formula.
So a lot there. There's something I want to touch on in terms of ancestors, because tradition is such an interesting opportunity for us to learn from the mistakes of the past. But then going
Mhm.
back to the 1960s in Western culture, it feels like there was a throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Mhm.
And then there's the other thing about AI coming in and having this transformational technology, and that's only one of the transformational technologies that may influence our lives heavily, that maybe there is no map to what we're going through, that like we have to make these mistakes, just like you were saying at the individual level. These mistakes, we're going to make mistakes as an individual, and those are
Mhm.
opportunities to change it. And maybe the ancestral wisdom isn't actually that applicable to our current situation. What's your take on that?
I think there's map. I think there's map, but it's not one map. And it depends on where you're on the map. Like take a Google map or Apple map, in general. People might be arguing like, oh, well, the map should always have green for roads and, blue for whatever. And then we're like, well, what about the satellite view? And what about the street view? So I think one why we need to look at ancestral wisdom is there is a map because
Mm,
most of us age and go through life phases very similarly, I would say. There is a map, but there's the individuality of where are you on the map and then which direction are you looking at? Maybe you want to go north, but then you're looking at south. And then you keep saying, well, I want to go south. Or you're looking at the map upside down, you know? So there's lots of problems with that. So the other thing is the just like development cycle of humanity or humans, individuals, there's one for society that, you know, that's what the cyclic model of Eastern wisdom would say. It's cycles. So you just have to identify the phase and the level that you're
mm.
at. So usually, yes, the literal interpretation of ancestral wisdom is not going to work because they would their instincts and how they've gone through it, right? Even the foreturning of America and all those
Yep.
books have said, right? If you look at the archetypal thing, usually the past strategy doesn't really work. So you actually have to look at like n-4 or n-2, skip the generations, and then you will find it. So same thing in Buddhism and all those things. When we look at it, if we look at the exactly 19th century, 18th century, that wisdom is actually incomplete. But if we look at 2,500 years or 2,300 years, the wisdom is more complete, but it's not going to be as complete as it was there. So you still have to transform it to what is more relevant here. So yeah, I would say it's not just the n-1, it's the whatever
Yeah, brilliant. It's
that's
like a
the
it's
right phase.
the shell. It's the shell that's repeating, like the fractal shell,
Mm.
that you go back further, and there is a lot of wisdom in the axial age, but then it's also harder to apply that wisdom because it's lost in the past, and we have fragments of it. Those fragments are really beautiful, but they're disconnected from the context. And this brings in a direct, beautiful kind of alliteration or analogy into AI. I consider artificial intelligence, at least the chatbot version, and I know there's a lot of different versions, but at least this chatbot
Mm.
version is this, or what the chatbot version represents, is as impactful as the invention of the written word. And so I've been going back
Mm.
to that written word and trying to understand what was the consciousness like before the written word, and then what was it like after it, and then also going into the printing press in the 15th century and understanding what
Mm.
happened. I'm reading this awesome book called The Invention of News, which goes into the invention of news as a business in the 15th century with the printing
So you
press.
consider this like language, written word creation, and more so than just even printing.
Yeah, I'm thinking all the way back to the axial age, like what happened when people first started
Mm.
writing down their thoughts. And the two most interesting use cases for writing down those thoughts were accounting and spiritual religious works, which I find hilarious because like those are like the total profane commerce versus the total spiritual God. Like those were the two things that
Mm.
people had to start writing about immediately once they had the written word. And then now we have AI, and AI is totally changing the nature of the book for me, at least in terms of technical books. When I want to learn something, I no longer need to go into a book and try to pull out what I find. I now have a conversation with the book intermediated by this artificial intelligence. I like to call it artificial knowledge. We might have talked in our last talk about how
Mm.
it's artificial linear algebra is basically what's going on behind these things. But uh, th- I forgot the original point that got me onto this. But what's your take on this idea that this is like the written word? It may have such a large effect on our consciousness as the written word.
Well, I want to be clear that in the actual age in the East,
Mm,
it wasn't all written down first. It was
mm, yes.
oral
Yeah.
transmission, right? So sometimes I think that's the thing that we need to appreciate, right? As an engineer or whatever, there's always trade-offs. Uh, so you say oral transmission, it's like faulty memory and all that. If you just written it down, it would have been so much better and blah, 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 blah. But then we find that actually the energetic transmission
Mm,
and the nuance of it got lost.
yeah.
And when you write it down, and if you don't have the teacher or somebody to explain it, you can interpret it wrong. Um, I would say the danger is in the margins, right? Just like when you're talking about AI and stuff, I do think it's a very big change. I think probably there will be, we thought internet was big, but I think in our lives and in our looking to the future, I don't foresee that there's any bigger change than that with AI, whether it's printing press level or the invention of written word. I don't know. But I do know this is probably the seminal sea change for all of us. But I think there's also inherent danger in how that, I would call it maybe not artificial linear algebra, but superficial linear algebra. It's that chance of hallucination.
Mm,
And here's a nuance. If it's hallucinating all the time, that's easy. If it's true all the time, that's easy. It's when you're trying to understand these hard concepts, even in the use case brought up, how do you when it was the important time to understand a key concept and it
yeah,
hallucinated?
yeah,
You
yeah,
don't know because you're the learner
yeah.
and you don't know the source material, right? And that's where the role of a teacher comes in, where you recognize the student. It's like, wait, you had made a critical conceptual mistake here. Like, how come you turned it this way? And I think that's going to be, but that's inherent in the way that the universe is made, I think.
Yeah.
As powerful something is, there's some critical flaw in it
Yes.
so that it could have a chance of this incompleteness or something wrong. And it's non-deterministic. So you don't know when it will happen. You do know there's a chance. So I think that that's sort of the crux of the matter. It's so powerful, yet at the same time, at the critical time, it might fail you and you didn't know because you've already kind of created this trust or this model that I can rely on it as a source of information. And it will be, right? There's no question this technology will be so prolific and ubiquitous that everybody would have made that assumption. So yeah, I think, again, going back to oral history and things like that, what we find is you actually have to use all of them, all of these modalities, and trying to use the academic research and everything, and then comparative literature, and then look at what would the oral history would have been trying to say. Why were they doing mnemonics and all that stuff, like rising and falling of the rhythm, all those things
Mm,
in not just the stories, because a lot of the older material were verses, not prose.
mm,
So
mm. Wait, what is the difference between a verse and a prose?
it's like a poetry rather than
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah, yeah.
like a written word, and they were very short. So they call it pit instructions, right? The other way of saying it is maybe like encrypted and zipped kind of
Yeah,
information. So
yeah,
people
that's
will say, "Oh, I downloaded it." You're like, "Well, do you have the decryption key and do you have the unzip?
yeah,
Otherwise, what you
interesting.
get is maybe some corrupted bits."
And that I believe that that was on purpose. I've heard of this before, that the sages were enigmatic for the express purpose that once you get beyond a certain level, you're talking to people from who can't understand it. And so if you
Mm,
falsely transmit something by being too specific about your level, you're essentially like going to lead them off the way because they'll create this whole interpretation, which again, if you can feel free to interrupt me if there's anything to add on there, but it goes back to what you were saying about needing a teacher. One of the main problems I ran into was I went off on my autodidactic, let me just ask Google,
mm,
interpret it under my own understanding, and it just led me to these really strange places. And now I see the same thing happening in the Bay Area.
mm,
And there recently somebody published a AI wearable that is going to allow lonely people to treat the AI as its friend, as a companion. And I just
mm.
see that kind of growing into this strange incel mixture where the main sort of relating is happening with this AI, but the AI isn't really conscious. It's sort of the simulation of this thing, and then like real human interactions becomes this thing that happened in the past, basically among a large part of the population. A smaller part of the population seems like it's going to go what. And there's another thread here too, which is that a business idea or maybe a community idea where teachers use AI in a way that helps the student, but it always leads back to a human in the loop. Then
Mm.
the problem becomes determining who the authentic teachers are, which is always the problem. But what's your take on that?
I don't think the ancient and the Buddha and
Mm,
people were trying to be like enigmatic and
mm,
hard to understand. I think it just the complexity of the thing makes it so that sometimes poetry really captures the feeling and the
Yeah.
wholeness of it all, rather than this whole like very cold description of this,
Yeah. Hmm.
whatever the
Hmm.
wisdom or the experiences. I think it just the limitation of language in a sense. So I think they try their best. I think it's just capacity of the listeners and people. And I would say in my teaching career, no matter how I think I am so being so clear, only an A or A plus student really understand. And
Yeah.
and people accuse me of that, and I'm like, in a way, I'm probably making it as understandable as I am capable of.
Yeah.
Just because, and I don't even know what you're confused about. So I kind of feel a little bit empathy
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's a little bit also understanding of human in the loop. Um, I don't think it's necessary that it needs to be human in the loop, because human is also fallible, like any teachers and whatever will be, right? Like, how do you know that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
human is
Yeah.
making the right conjecture and the right thing? It doesn't mean anything. But I think the seed or the kernel of the AI or whatever it's doing, that needs to be from the human, or that needs to be from the wisdom.
Hmm.
Kind of like your idea of AI companionship. It's a very obvious business idea, right? But would you do it? Would I do it? No, because you don't see a good outcome from that, right? And I thought about this too. Let's say I have some psycho or somebody, who wants to kill people or molest, whatever it is. What if I can put them in a VR simulation and let them
Hmm.
go to town on that, right?
Hmm.
Technically, in terms of karma and what we would think about, they're not harming any humans, any beings, right? But then you think, wait, am I making
Ooh.
that person better? Or am
Yeah.
I
Interesting.
actually adding to the habitual patterns and all these urges and pulses, and then they're somehow like, is there a good outcome for them? And you think long term, and you say no. So that solution is not good. And that's a problem with all of these things. When you look at only short term and you're not looking at it from a wisdom point of view, you're like, oh, well, there's a demand for the market. So, and it certainly can do it. So why wouldn't I do it? And all these people, for some reason, with the way the human mind works, they want to be fooled. They know it's superficial. They know it's artificial. They know they're probably not talking to that woman or person on OnlyFans or whatever. But
Yeah.
somehow you have to have that protection mechanism in your mind that that fake belief is enough. So then you're like, wait, but then in terms of my objective of wisdom and stuff like that, you're like, well, I'm just only adding to that. So we wouldn't do that. But yeah, I think that's uh, Yuval Harari talks about with the AI and dataism and things like that. In the future, there's going to be a useless class created. So for me, probably we're looking about maybe 20-30% of society is going to be in that useless class where they waste all their time in these kind of endeavors in this simulated artificial kind of things, right?
Hmm.
But then the bigger maybe point about all the simulation theory kind of
Yeah.
aficionados would
Yeah.
maybe we're already in
Yeah.
it. So
Well,
so
and this goes into sort of a something that exists in Buddhism. It kind of is alluded to by Jesus in terms of reincarnation.
mm,
In terms of and so the 20 to 30% of the society who gets trapped in the simulation of the simulation, if this
mm,
is a simulation, that
yeah.
20 to 30%, it's my understanding that on a long enough timeline that those people will essentially realize the lack of realness in the simulation and then
Mm,
try to inquire into what is real and then
yeah.
be going this. And this also reminds me of something we talked about in our conversation on our unrecorded conversation last time, was that you have a particular sort of criticism of Gnosticism, and or not, maybe not Gnosticism, Advaita Vedanta, which is
Mm,
sort of like the Eastern version of Gnosticism. And it also feels like this is related to that. This sort of because my understanding of Advaita Vedanta is says that the phenomenal world is not real. Therefore, like try to find the one real thing, and the real thing is the self. And there is a self. It is a soul. It's Brahman. But the self with the lowercase is not real. It's a simulation. It's an illusion, and that we must find the real thing. If that's an accurate representation, what's your criticism of it? And if not, feel free to correct my interpretation.
I would say generally it's the overemphasis of either the whole or the vision, the big picture versus the small picture and the details. So my biggest criticism is in terms of when you look at the practitioners, they no longer can deal with the details and the particulars of their lives, and they're not functional in this simulation or this reality. And my thing is, if you want to beat the game, you have to get to the final boss and play the game. You got to play the game with the rules and everything. And then you're like, well, all of this game you don't need to play. And I think that's another sort of an easy spiritual bypass kind of tendency, similar to incel kind of thing. It's like, well, I'm not competitive in here, so I'm going to somehow transcend it by not competing. So I think that's the danger. So if people don't have that danger, I don't have the problem with that. But like I said, as I find some people right now are too much into the details in particular, forget the whole. Some people are like, it's all about the whole. And then to me, to get to the whole. And then there's also a other danger is if you think it's all about this individuality, it's all delusion and everything, then usually, not always, but sometimes it leads to people fracturing their mind and completely getting rid of this sense of stable self. And that is a very big danger because then you lead to all sorts of bad outcomes from this superficial reality point of view, like suicide, depression, etc. Everything that you wouldn't want, anxiety, all that. And then they're not functional and they think, oh, now I've transcended it. It's like, no, I think you just become non-functional player. So for me, those are the dangers, right? So, but I think when you get to that unity and you can do that and you don't lose the whole and you don't have these functional problems, then all what they talk about is probably all correct. It's okay. It's just a question of how do you get there, you know?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's all the levels. There's so many levels to this thing, and when we think we've reached a level, then there's another level that appears, and local minimum, like you said, it's like, how do I know where I am right now compared to the longer term? And this gets into the what I would love to talk about as well is because I'll set this up a little bit. I love John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis because it gives me a map to my own cultural grammar. And he includes some things from Buddhism, but his understanding of the evolution of Buddhism isn't as sort of he doesn't have the cultural grammar. He is just a practitioner from the Western culture who's looked at it and incorporated some of it into his thought. And then what I want to understand, I grew up with the Christian stories. I grew up with the Abrahamic religion stories. Like those are in me. I don't have that same level of understanding for the Buddhist ones. And and this could relate to AI as well in terms of the asuras and the devas, because you had mentioned something really interesting the last time about AI being sort of like this asuric energy that exists. But first, before going into that pattern, there's the understanding of like what are the main stories of Buddhism and how do they relate to the evolution of Buddhism as it went through all these cycles? It's a big question.
I mean, Theravada, which is what I am, we call ourselves Theravada, and that means the school of elders, or the wisdom or the teachings of the elders. But the other strands of Buddhism call us Hinayana, which is the small vehicle, because why? They're Mahayana. Maha is big. They're the big vehicle. So some people take it a denigration, but for me, it's just the reality. We're the small and they're big. So, when we're talking about market forces and incels and things like that, there was the original wisdom and original complexity of it. But in order to make it popularize and go across the globe in the East, especially, and things like that, I think there's always tendency to play to the market in some ways. But just speaking from our business point of view and things like that, if the market is not accepting your solution, whatever, no matter how good your product is, it's also a useless product, right? So I think there's clear criticism to my school.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people know about the Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism kind of conception of Buddhism and Mahayana, things like that. For us, it would be they are incomplete or changes of the original. and they simplify too many things. So we consider theirs to be 31 different realms of it. And for us, speaking of your Abrahamic heaven and things like that, we have no issues with it. We just think there are six of them, six layers. And usually when you're talking about the layers that people get to and still communicating with the humans and stuff like that, it's the first two layers. And then in the Hinduism, they talk about Brahma, right? Things like that, the Advaita Vedanta Brahma. We have 20 different levels of Brahma levels. So, so it's not just one being, is there are different levels of, so it's a question of what scale you really understand the universe in, like just our solar system. Are you geocentric? Are you heliocentric? And then you think, okay, how many stars? Okay, I personally think each Brahma is like a star.
Mm.
So when you say a Brahma can give birth to all the humans, all the sentient beings they know, it's the sun is literally doing that, from our scientific understanding. So it's not an incorrect statement, except we all know the sun will die at some point. So, the longer you live, when you think about it, the more painful the death will be. And it's a very violent death, the supernova and whatnot. And then we have the galaxy. I recently actually got into how the fact is that the universe is probably not 3 dimension, but 2.7 E, the natural number E. So non-integer dimensions. And that's why you actually get a lot of 2D planar galaxies. So disks and all those rotations, because it actually grows from 1D to 2D and then it stops at 2.7. So most of what you see is the 2D and it's very planar.
Interesting.
So there's an actual professor who's really famous. He wrote papers on that. So anyway, just to say that then not just one galaxy, how many galaxies? So, the scale at which the universe is made or simulation or otherwise is like mind-boggling, right? So then, all right, so then drop back down to the fact that there's so much complexity. So then it's no wonder people just say,
I'm done with
just
it.
think about three,
Yeah.
heaven, hell, and human, because at least human we know heaven. So hell, we also have minor levels of 9, but generally Buddhism actually cannot be understood without the Hindu context.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing that a lot of modern Buddhists are missing, especially since it's all esoteric and things like that. So, when we're talking about Asuras and Devas, there was the ocean churning kind of thing, because everybody's looking for some sort of immortality, a way of Amrit. So they were trying to find that immortality, and you think alchemy and all of them, when you really look at it, everybody just have this denial of death problem, just trying to live forever and then stave it off. So they were looking for it, right? So from my understanding, and it's not in Buddhism or Hinduism, like succinctly, but if you look at all the Greek myths of the old gods fighting with the new gods, and the old gods tends to be more elemental and more powerful, but the new generation is of course going to take over somehow, some way, no matter what they do. So that's the same thing with the Deva and the Asuras fighting over Mount Olympus kind of thing, but they had to cooperate together in order to get the emirate. And then the good guys, actually, if you look at those stories, literally, they cheat a lot. They didn't share the emirate that they said they would. And then, so the old guys have a really good right within their thing to be pissed off and then like try to fight back. So, so it's always like kind of iffy whenever you read these things and you're like, wait a minute, the good guy is not exactly broad with everything. Anyway, so then that's ongoing battle. And when we're talking about 1960 LSD, I think it was a way of sort of getting humans into that battle. So a way of seeding the humans with these things. So I think higher level realms from Buddhism kind of always looking at how do I get more forces that either the way I say that is because in the Buddhist scriptures, it talks about how during the Buddhist time, all the devas were really happy because people were doing all this, meditation and all this merits. And then when they die, the deva forces keep increasing. So then they keep winning over the ashuras. Things like that. So then it's a back and forth affair. So then ashuras are like, oh, well, you don't give energy, so let me go get energy. And humans are the easiest energy to get people from. So these main gods, right? The more people who worship and say their name, the more powerful they are. So they kind of just get more followers, like kind of like social media kind of thing. So
Yeah.
it sees the humanity, I think, in some ways. And then, so yeah, so that's what we were talking about, where it seems like this changing technology time has come, AI.
Yeah.
The only question is, from who did it come from?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
So, but okay, and this gets to the crux of my challenge with current Western discourse is that, and it's maybe not so much right now, but about 2 or 3 years
mm,
ago, 5 years ago, the materialists were reigning champions of determining what is real. So
mm,
when I inject or when I bring a thought that implies some sort of spiritual reality into the conversation, I'm automatically rejected as woo, not rigorous enough, all of these different things. And this is really interesting for me because I think it's failing. I think the materialist, we don't understand reality enough to say that everything is material. There are a lot of things that have shown that at least the Western model was false of geocentric,
mm,
there's a heaven up there. That heaven up there is there, and everything's much smaller than
mm,
we thought. Like everything's much bigger than we thought, and there are these
mm,
deterministic planets moving around that collide with each other all on their own with no divine origin. Um, and but then there's quantum mechanics, and I don't want to sort of make my spiritual understanding of the world dependent on something that I don't fully understand, like quantum mechanics. But the reality is not as we see it. It doesn't feel material in its origin. Like at least there is a case that that's not the case. At least there is a good argument to be made that we should still consider the fact that there is a spiritual reality. And Buddhism doesn't argue with that. Doesn't seem like Christianity doesn't argue with that either. Like Christianity, I find it fascinating that the Protestants in if you go back to the Salem witch trials, and witches in general and sorcery and magic also coincided with the rise of magic. I'm sorry, with the rise of science in the
mm,
1500s. Like both of those started together. Like before, magic was accepted as real before then, but science with Newton and others, they both rose at the same time. And a lot of the witches in the Salem witch trial were self-professed witches. They called themselves witches. Killing them was not a good idea. I don't condone that at all. But the Christian culture allows for spiritual realities, and then it's been replaced by atheistic secular, which says no, none of
mm.
it exists, and if you say it, you're not to be taken seriously. Uh, so that was sort of like a diatribe or a rant or whatever. But do you have anything to say about that? Like, well, because it seems like within the secular stuff, within the Bay
Mm,
Area, within the ecstatic dance, within the consciousness hacking, there is this acceptance, but you have to go totally crazy with it, and like there's no tradition for it.
mm.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a shame, right?
Yeah.
That's because I think you've been burned enough times, maybe both literally and figuratively, over the history about that,
Yeah.
because that's why people with like John Vervaeke and Jim Rutt are very anti two world, what they would
Yes.
call
Yes.
two
Yeah.
world
Yeah.
model.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm not saying that. And then,
Yeah.
maybe they, I don't know what, or Jordan Peterson,
Yep.
so I feel like if you want to be a Western intellectual, whether it's
Yes.
like a
Yes.
deadly fuel or not, you have to make that approach. And
Yeah.
then we talked about Jordan Hall and, Douglas Murray and people. So people, again, going through the same thing in the 60s, you're like, "Wait, isn't there something beyond?" And then there's only two choices, which is to adopt the traditional understanding and explanation
Yeah.
or find an evolved version. And I feel like a lot of people, it's personally disappointing to me that Jordan Hall would fall into the traditional explanation, traditional structure. You're like, but didn't we just say in our search-based exploration that that is not a scalable solution, and then you need a better one, and then now you somehow default to it? So I think same thing with people like Jim Rutt, now he's old, but he's like, I made that determination when I was 11 or something. So then
Yeah. Yeah.
you can't sort of go back to the old time where you thought, oh, I'm smart enough to see through this.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
I think that's the Christian trauma in a sense, that
Yeah.
I think
Interesting.
you kind of just have to recover. Whereas for us in Buddhists and things like that,
It's
we
totally
grew up
normal. It's
with
totally
it
accepted.
culturally. So you're like, yeah, what's the problem? Like, you know, so
What are you guys worried about?
I think that's a very Western struggle from the Abrahamic religion that you just gonna have to find a way out without falling backwards. And again, that's the hard thing about all of these things, right? Because you think, well, tradition must have been all right, but then there's so much empirical data to show that tradition was full of shit. Like they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But but you again, you can't throw away all of it,
Yeah.
mainly because no matter what, you've been shaped by it. The thinking, the culture, like the history, the whatever it is. So I think that's always the mistake when you say, oh, and I think my main criticism, talking about someone concrete or something like that, like main criticism of someone like John Vervaeke, I mean, he's doing it a little bit with Neoplatonism and stuff like that, where he's recovering the Western culture more.
Mm.
But if you look at all his personal ecology of practices or whatever, it's all Eastern, like Tai Chi Chuan and
Yeah.
Buddhism and
Yeah.
teaching meditation. And then it's like, wait, didn't you grow up
Oh,
like
interesting.
preacher, son or whatever? So like, until they do that, I don't believe that they would have a complete understanding of this rebirth to really put all the pieces back in. And for me, being born Buddhist and things like that, I realize it makes my life so much easier, because I've never been tempted to find answers outside. I'm incorporating all these things, AI, technology, Hinduism, all that to expand my thing, but I'm not wholesale changing my framework. And I think that's a sad thing about people from the West is that you're more willing to wholesale all your thing, change all your beliefs
Yeah.
or the frameworks or everything. And I think it's adding to the instability of it because you're denying who you are and where you come from because you're kind of ashamed or at
Yeah.
least guilty about all the things that the Christianity and Western culture has brought to the world. And I don't think you should be, but you just have to have wisdom about that.
And it's so interesting because it also feels like it's something that in Christianity's discovery of the scientific method and all of these hidden forces that were acting on our world, realizing that God is definitely not the way that the tradition had pictured God as this sort of like theistic
Mhm.
personhood, that doesn't seem relevant anymore. So like Nietzsche sort of killed the idea of God. But then this is why it's so interesting that Buddhism comes in, because according to the West, Buddhism is the beautiful option because it doesn't require a belief in a theistic God. Is that accurate? What is the understanding of God within Buddhism in Theravada?
We would ask which God,
Yeah, which God?
right?
Because it's coming from India, where there's just this pantheistic legion of gods. Yeah,
And
yeah,
which level, right? I just told you there's six
yeah,
level of heaven, 20 levels of Brahma. So which one? You're
and
talking
that's
about Sagittarius star or the our sun or so I think it's just a wrong question to us, like for us.
yeah, interesting. But that's the
But
fundamental
to
question for the
follow up
West.
on that,
Yeah.
look at the strand of Buddhism that's been popular so far in terms of what people like Alan Watts with Zen, right?
Yeah.
So all this
Yeah. Yeah.
abstract kind
Yeah.
of thing where you're like kind of,
What are
and
you
then
doing?
they
Nothing.
they run into all these logical problems, but the West doesn't know about that, and then they try to wholesale adopt those, and then or other versions of Buddhism, right? So this early Buddhism and there's like some guy, Doug, I think, on YouTube that talks about early Buddhism and things like that. But the thing is, what I'm saying is if people want to adopt Buddhism, they have to really, people say, I don't want to believe in rebirth. Then you're using a solution that's made for a particular problem
Mm,
of rebirth.
mm.
So if you don't have the problem formulation right and you're
Yeah.
not buying the problem formulation, then the solution is just not for you. I mean, that I'm probably very anti-Buddhist in a way, right? In the sense
Yeah.
that it's like, this is for a particular problem. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
Buddha didn't say anything, but if you're like, well, I think I'm smart enough and I think I see through the problem and it's not really the problem, then why are you using the solution?
And that goes again back to the destruction of the theistic God, that like it's so fundamental to the Abrahamic religions to have one God, just one thing, just Gnosticism. Like it's just like
Yeah.
that seems so fundamental. And it's a very, very interesting, and I don't have any answers. And I want to make sure that we have time to go over into the deep technical stuff of AI as well.
Sure.
Do you have to go at the hour, or can you go a little bit
No,
after?
no, no,
Okay.
I can go.
Yeah. So the AI, so we've got software, we've got hardware. Most people only think about hardware these days because I'm sorry, most people only think about software these days because the hardware has become just such a part of the scenery that it's like most
Mm,
of the things that they interact with are the software. But underlying all of these things are increases in computation made possible by GPUs, made possible by, and a GPU is a hardware and it's a graphics processor, but it's somehow become really important in terms of AI. What can you explain to beginners about hardware? And then also, can you talk about your specific solution with Alan?
Generally, software tends to be sequential, right? You're doing a certain sequence of instructions and you're executing them. And generally, hardware tends to be parallel. So, you're doing things in concurrent. So even though, and I think people who are from computer science know that we actually still haven't solved this concurrency problem in, things. The way that we just make things run is just run multiple programs, but when they have to interact and things like that, it's still a big problem and slow down in performance. So, Hadoop and all those internet scale kind of thing, people have solved it, but only because things can be done not independently. Whenever you have this dependency, your communication overhead is going to kill. So there's a fundamental way that hardware people think and software people think differently. And then GPUs and this AI in general are what we would call embarrassingly parallel, right? It's embarrassing because it's so independent that you don't have to work at making it parallel. And then raw
Oh,
horsepower kind of wins out.
oh,
So, that's the technical name, embarrassingly parallel. So, and generally that's, with all the pixels on the screen, it's each of them is independent. So, and the way that the
oh,
calculations you have to make is like very the same pipeline. So, you're just doing the same shader logic and things like that to do that. So it just so happened that the AI workload, as the way that deep learning and current modern AI models are made, is very amenable to that, which is the more processing units you have, the faster you can make it because you can just parallelize everything. But generally, how software people think, it's just, like I said, it's sequential. It's in threads and processes and things like that. So it's just a very different mindset. So that's why most people are not able to do one. Like hardware people can adopt because software, but not the other way around usually. And I would
yes.
even say that most people these days, when they're doing AI, because they're doing Jupyter notebooks or
Uh-huh.
Python or things like that, they're not even actually doing it at the level of software, not the way that we would think in terms of
Oh,
traditional software, computer science, right? They're very much they don't think about just the cost of doing string comparisons versus like integer operations. There's no the fact that it's not typed is meant to be a good thing, but actually for performance and functionality and checking kind of thing, it's actually bad, right? So all the things as a computer science teacher I would cringe at, people do like they're like, oh, I have a 1 gigabyte file of all the CSV and all the data. Oh, let's just use pandas and let me just read it into a data frame. Okay. It works, but it's such a huge computing resource kind of thing that we probably wouldn't think about doing it maybe 10 years ago.
yes.
So anyway, I would say that, but that's the way
Yeah.
that productivity of all these things go. It's you get more and more abstracted. We just harkening back to our concept of simulation and stuff like that. I think that's how it happens. Generally, the underlying layer is so complex that you have to abstract. And then you abstract it enough layers, then it becomes kind of like a simulation because it's no longer directly related to the actual underlying reality. So I think that's the way that we have to cope with our existence and remain functional and things in some
Wait,
ways. So
sorry. So this, because as the Gnostics would say, the thing that, or the Advaita Vedantins would say, the thing that is thinking right now, this thing that I understand
mm,
is me, is not actually me. It's just a process. It's just a
yeah,
simulation of something
yeah,
deeper. but that simulation is really important because it allows me to survive in this world where there's monkeys and sorry, tigers. The monkeys aren't going to kill me, but the tigers might kill me.
Yeah,
And so it allows me to survive, but it has no real meaning, just in the same way that an abstract computer program isn't paying attention to the laws of the hardware that runs it.
exactly. Like Hoffman, right? If you what Hoffman said about the
Mm-hmm.
GUI kind of thing, you're not going to be like, this is a literal file icon and I'm killing it, right? You just, deleting a pointer to that file, right? So
Yeah.
it's just, it's ridiculous. But then if you delete that file and you needed it for your presentation or for your work, then it is like,
It's
it's a
important. Yeah.
real pain. Like,
Yeah.
it's not just first world problem. So again, I think it's people's inability to think in that same abstract level and then treat that as important. I wouldn't call it real, but as
Yeah.
important,
Interesting.
and it's
Interesting.
logically coherent and consistent and still functional on that level, and still know that there's a lower level.
Yeah.
And by the
Yeah.
way, talking about quantum and all that, my side comment would be there's always this discrete versus continuous flip-flop between understanding, right? We mentioned geocentric, heliocentric, but that was all big body problem. That was discrete model,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
then relativity came, which is all about continuous space-time fabric, things
Yeah.
like that. And then we go quantum, right? What is quantum? Quanta just mean
Yeah.
discrete, right?
Yeah.
But what if Advaita Vedanta says it's oneness? That's continuous. So
Yeah.
we're always arguing about, do you think underlying reality is continuous or discrete? I would say, well, it depends on which abstraction level you
You're
actually
looking
manage to
at.
get to.
Yeah.
And then the next one is usually the opposite. So after quantum, I think if people manage to get to the next level, probably it's continuous. But who's to say there isn't another discrete after that continuous one, right?
Yeah.
So
And the like, who is actually observing, who is making, who is it, what is the identity that is able to get to that next level of abstraction, or
yeah,
like
exactly.
it's I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and in a sense, it's like that's what Buddha said, right? In a sense, he's like, your framework and the questions you're asking stem from a particular abstraction
Yeah.
level and assumptions.
Yeah.
And it's irrelevant for the next level that you're trying
Yeah.
to get
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
So no matter how you craft it, it's going to be the wrong question. So that's why I always go back to just beat the level you're at.
Yeah.
And then let's talk next after you beat it. Until
Yeah.
you beat it, it's like, why even
Why are you even
bother?
talking about it? And that was a huge
Yeah.
loop that I got in over the past 10 years, was just like, oh, but I want to prepare for the next one. There is no preparation. Like, yeah,
No,
yeah.
there is some preparation,
Okay, yeah,
knowing that it's there and knowing whatever, but
yeah.
until you get there, like you're not gonna, and you're like, but I don't want to make a mistake. That's what I said earlier. You
Yeah,
will make a mistake.
yeah.
You just hope that you don't loop there.
Not
It's
a
not, you just hope
catastrophic.
that it's not another infinite loop, right? You're like,
Yeah,
after I break out of a for loop, you go to a while loop, you're like, but then it's a do while loop.
yeah.
You just
Okay, well,
you
and
just need to.
that's an interesting point, because like, we're talking about progress in the linear sense, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of cyclical stuff going on too. And in the
Yeah.
last week, I've like gone back into something that I had previously thought I was out of, and so it's like
Mm.
going back to a new or an old game that I thought I had beaten, and then reality pointing out that nope, still got to work on that random thing. And that, like, what about that part too, where it's like there is never it seems like there's always like a new way to go back as well.
Not always. It's just
Mm,
more layers than you think.
mm,
It's kind
yeah,
of like self-modifying code, right? You need to, it's not enough to maybe break a loop. You just need to make sure that you're breaking through enough layer of the loops that that code segment will never be executed again,
yes, yeah,
right?
yeah,
Just talking
interesting,
in
yeah, yeah,
a
yeah,
technical terms just because it makes it easier. Whereas if it's still a dormant code and just because your if else branches are not executed, you're like, oh, I'm beyond that. It's like, no, maybe
yeah,
you're just not executing that branch. So
yeah,
you really need
interesting.
to just get rid of that code. And that's what we Buddhists would call liberation. Nirvana and
Mm,
enlightenment is really fluffy, but I would just call it liberation in a sense is how many of those code segments do you really know for yourself that it will never be executed again, or
mm,
it's not in your program anymore. And
mm,
until you get to that layer, these things will come up because that's the way that the program is
yeah,
created, right? It's a again, it's a simulation or whatever, right? So it's
Yeah.
an infinite loop. So it only has finite number of programs to execute, especially for your being versus my being.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
it's just gonna keep executing those code blocks and function calls.
Yeah.
So and then you start to pattern match. You're like, wait a minute, I thought I did that, right? So that's why in esoteric terms we talk conscious level, subconscious, and then the unconscious. So unconscious we would just call it code blocks, right? It's
Mm.
and then the dynamic execution of those code is what you're seeing, but you have no choice but to go through the dynamic to somehow get to that core code to change it. And that's what I would think the Buddhism and all that it's about. But most
Mhm.
people are not capable of doing to that level. I think most people are happy that their code functionality is correct and they're not going bonkers on that.
Yeah.
But you're still going to be in that loop then.
Yeah. There's no liberation, but most people don't want liberation because that's like the structure, their whole structure would fall down, which is uh so the there's such an oh yeah, samskara. Does that word exist in Theravada or did it come later? Is samskara like the subtle impressions? Because what you just described
Yeah,
feels like
it's
a
it's
subtle
called it's
impression.
called sankharas.
Samkara,
So
samkara. Okay.
Sankara. So
Yeah.
Pali would
Yeah.
be Sankharas, and
Yeah.
then the Sanskrit is Samskaras.
Yeah.
It's the same. It's the
Yeah.
same concept. And
So that came
uh,
before Buddha. That was a part of the thing before Buddha came into the picture.
yes, because that
Okay.
was all of the Indus Valley Indian. They were all trying to get rid of the Samskaras.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And then Buddha came along and said, "Here's it. Here it is. Here's the way to do
But
it."
Buddha actually came along and said something more profound than that.
Uh,
You're worried about samskara, but there's actually what we would call asavas.
oh.
These seeds, the kernels of which we can give rise to a new program again.
Oh. Interesting.
Like so, so he's like until that was his discovery with the jhanas and things like that. That's how I read it anyway. He's like,
Mm.
I got rid of the samskaras and everything when I'm meditating, whatever. But then he realized, oh wait, I didn't touch
Yeah.
those
Interesting.
underlying seeds of asavas. So until I can get to that even that potentiality of it, you got to destroy all that probability of potentiality, not even this concrete program. Then I will call myself liberated.
Mhm.
And that was the biggest contribution of Buddha that because most people can't get to it, they kind of gloss over the centuries.
Yeah, because he was, and this is the mythology that he would go and meet these sages in the forest, and he would realize that they weren't liberated, even though they had spent so much time in ascetic
Mm,
practices and had gone farther than most other people. There were still these
yeah,
deeper layers of programs running that they couldn't touch. Um,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
then what about the method that Buddha offers about anapanasati or the breathing? Why is the breathing so important in Buddhism? Why did I get that? Why was that the one central thing that kept on getting put into my head while I was trying to approach it from my Western understanding of trying to break it all down?
The breath is the one that connects between the conscious and
Mm,
subconscious,
mm,
and either way, all the way down to unconscious. It's the main vehicle
mm.
because the breath, as both you and I are both breathing here, was probably not aware of it as we've been talking and thinking in these abstract high level terms. But it's doing its thing, autonomous, keeping us alive. But then if we want to inject ourselves into it and be aware of it or start to control it like pranayama, it can. So breath is the only object of meditation that has that functionality. Everything else
Mm,
doesn't.
mm.
But just as a warning though, in our commentary in kind of like commentary in Christianity, the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification. A lot of Westerners think it's Buddha's words, but it's also a lot of Asians think it's
Yeah,
Buddha's word,
yeah,
but it's
yeah,
not. It's a
yeah, yeah.
commentary from Sri Lanka. But in there, it says explicitly, Anapanasati should only be practiced by really advanced or
Oh,
really capable
no.
people. It's not for a
Oh
normal
boy.
person.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, right now in the
Whoa.
mindfulness or whatever culture, people think, oh, the breath is always there. You should use it. No, no, no. There's a clear warning in there. If you're not capable, do not do this. It's powerful and it's hard, and it's the hardest one. So,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that's I want to
yeah,
put that warning out there because then you can actually start to activate all there's a
yeah.
reason certain psychic or things like that kept suppress or
Yeah.
kept late,
Yeah.
keep it as potential in people because it's a protective mechanism of the mind.
Yeah.
And then you're like, I'm gonna go puncture that using the breath. Well, be careful what you wish for because it's meant to be powerful.
Yeah, it's rough. And so what was Buddha teaching then? If he wasn't going around teaching people anapanasati, like what was he? Was it parables like Jesus? Like what was he? I mean, this
No,
is hard.
no.
Yeah.
So the 9 qualities of the Buddha that I'm trying to a little bit emulate in AI and stuff like
Mm.
that is precisely this personalization, right?
Yeah.
You get these stories like he has his cousin who was really obsessed about this woman. He's like, this woman's so beautiful, I'm gonna marry her and blah blah blah. And then Buddha's like, okay, let me so he doesn't say do anapanasati,
Yeah.
like think everything is sexuality, like
Yeah.
he doesn't say that. He's like, um, let me show you a monkey, a female monk, an ape
Yeah.
monkey. He's like, compared to this, what do you think? You like the monkey or you like your girl? He's like, I like my girl. And then he goes and him the Devi, uh, female deva.
Yeah.
And then he's like, well, then the woman I was obsessed with is like a monkey to his cousin, right? The cousin said. And then so Buddha's like, okay, then who do you want? And he's like, of course I want the Devi.
Yeah.
Then here, practice this to become a Devi. And
Uh,
then
uh,
so
yeah.
we don't know exactly what he practiced, but his motivation was not pure at all. He was trying to get the Devi.
Yeah.
But then as he was practicing to be the Devi. So that's what we mean by personalization. You take somebody's obsession and then you inject wisdom into it. Right? No, there are other stories like that where there's this one monk, famous monk later on, didn't have enough intellectualization and memorization to memorize one stanza. One stanza is like 8 syllables.
Mm.
And his own brother kicked him out,
Oh wow.
saying, you're an idiot, right? You can't even memorize one stanza to meditate on. But then Buddha found him around the way, and then he's like, okay, it's fine. Let me give you a white cloth. Keep rubbing the white cloth and just keep rubbing it and then contemplating and looking at it. And then the more he rubbed because of oil and dirt and everything, it became dirty. He realized, oh, the Advaita Vedanta kind of thing. The mind is pure, and then all this stuff makes it impure. So if I wash it or whatever, it will become pure. And then he became an arhat that,
Yeah.
know all the stanzas and everything. But until he got there and you put a precondition that he has to memorize some stuff, he would never get there. So even a renowned teacher who's even a brother of this guy couldn't help the guy. But what is a Buddha? Buddha realized, okay, at his capacity level, he's
Yeah.
capable, but let me give him something that he can do now and then take forward. So that's the philosophy that I'm trying to emulate.
Yeah, and there's something about a sage's ability to pinpoint exactly where someone is on the map, which is why it's so crazy valuable to be near one and to have a personal
Yes.
relationship one, because they can just see it in this sort of nonlinear outside of our scientific understanding of how to do it. And it's very fascinating.
No, I
There,
would say
yeah,
actually, no, I don't
yeah,
think it's so mysterious. I think
yeah.
it's more pattern matching.
Mm.
They've seen so many examples
Interesting.
based on it's like a big data meeting, big compute for AI something. Like they have a very good model, and then the student come and goes,
Yeah, interesting.
I see. He's stuck here. Like the particulars of the cloth or whatever, maybe there's an art to it. But I think a lot of it is science where you're like, oh, this person is the same thing for me. I can tell you just personally from my side when I meet people or whatever, you're like, you can type it. It's not
Yeah,
that many
it's
different patterns.
yeah, interesting. Um, yeah, because they see it, it's because of their daily life, basically, that allows them to witness it. Okay, so
And they're not, getting involved in the process, right? They're just taking the
mm,
data as is.
yeah,
They're
interesting.
not like, I wish this person is better or whatever. They're like,
Yeah,
let me
yeah.
can like,
Which is
objectively say,
which is always the refreshing quality, which is like because everyone else is all seeing me or seeing you or seeing all these
yeah,
other people against their whole entire history and these emotional samskaras. And it's so
yeah,
refreshing to meet somebody who just doesn't do any of that. Um, but it's so rare
right.
too. Yeah, I think we'll have to do another one because we didn't even get to the hardware part. So in the last 5 minutes, what does Alin do?
Lynn is trying to use this personalization kind concepts into a very easy math, which is just a math. So math as a subject is really easy, right or wrong, or when somebody knows the concept or not. And we have different levels of it. So it's targeting kids K to 12 to begin with. And then we also know that math is one of those stress-inducing kind of subjects, right? Even people who are good at it, we can always increase the difficulty by making them do faster and faster. So we have both the completeness and correctness, but also a time limit on these problem and worksheets. So we control that. But the AI is kind of, and then when the students are onboarded, we teach them basic breath counting exercise. This doesn't appear in any historical thing, but because we're trying to ask them how many breaths do you take in certain amount of time, in 5 second kind of thing. Usually you count to up to 5 or 10, because what I want is a baseline breath rhythm of a kid. And then we take that sample every day or every session, whatever they come. And then when we detect certain things that is out of bounds, we have two different things, right? One is to relax them, the other is to increase their energy. So the AI and our basic models are doing that as they're learning the math. So this is a way of teaching it in context of things like that. And then the adults part of the company and the website is, again, trying to do these personalizations. We have mental states or physical pains and things like that people have based on the Vipassana theory. We have about 31 different meditations that people can do. And then you have the baseline everyday meditation that people do, either the breath or the body scan and things like that. These are just tools, but we're trying to figure out a way. And I haven't really figured out a great way for adults, because we don't know what their psychological state, unlike the kids, but generally
Oh,
trying to build the AI towards this personalization. It's like, based on what you know, I have no bones in the game in its sense of like, you must do this style. It's like, no, but there should be a theory, right? If somebody is deficient in one, you're trying to fill it up not just like, you should always breathe fast. It's like, no, depending on the psychological state, right? If you're hyperventilating, you should do something to break yourself out.
Okay, this is
What a
really
lin is. And then based on that engine, that will go to all the other I'm doing, so that AI engine is the main one that I want to build for, basically humanity, in a way to emulate only what a Buddha can do. I mean, very, very, like, I don't know, less than 1% emulation, but still better than nothing, where based on someone's context, their history, their personality, and the things that they're doing, diet, culture, career, job, family relationship, whatever it may be, you try to give a recommendation that's informed by that. So that's the goal in a few years, that engine. And the reason why we're doing math and things like that is, the more powerful model we have, we want to go and always checking it, like regression testing in these very easy maps. Like, does it still work here, or does it do hallucination or other things that make it so that it's trying to shortcut something that it no longer works for this abstraction level. So yeah, so that's the main sort of research thesis and business thesis of I'm trying to build these things on. So all this esoteric stuff and everything, it informs the kind of solution I'm trying to build.
very interesting. And it's funny because I've been trying to find a math teacher. I tried it many years ago, just a math teacher who was good at math, to teach me math. But the problem with him was that he was not a psychologist, or because there's deep emotional blocks for me to learn math that can't be overcome through just a teacher who knows math, but who, so I've been looking for a math teacher who's also a psychologist. And I would like to try out your
Sure.
platform to see if it fits what I'm trying to do. Okay, well, thank you
That's
so
the
much,
main thing
Diego, for
about trauma work and everything too, right? Just to put
yeah.
that point in, it's you want to put that into similar situation, but at a much smaller stake and not at the original intensity level. And then you want to process through that. So probably that's where you have all this stuff around math, right? So you have to be doing math or doing something similar as those trauma, those reactions arise. You have to prove to yourself that you can transcend them or process them somehow.
Yeah,
And then the more you do that, then that original problem will be smaller, right? So I think
exactly.
that would be the same process and formula that I would advise people to do in meditation or therapy work, or even learning, everything, right? It's a lot of it is psychological. Not all of it,
Yep.
but a lot of it is.
Yep. Well, thank you so much for
Cool.
coming on the
Thanks.
show. How can people find out more about Lin?
Just go to alin.ai and everything is on that website.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.